in everything that we seem to do in medical device reprocessing, or maybe even other subjects for that matter, is normally it's a cut and paste of what our neighbors do. So we have the architects that come in and they'll cut and paste the design from the hospital that they just did and say, okay, well, we've won the contract. This is the design we're proposing. And it carries on as a cut and paste model. They cut and paste from every hospital and keep taking it to the next hospital. And the problem there is that you inherit the same problems the other hospitals inherit. So then you become this circle of hospitals that all have the same problem because we all just kind of copied one another.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you are tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now, turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Gary Bassi, Director of Medical Device Reprocessing at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto. Gary has been working in the field of medical device reprocessing since 2013. He has currently taken on the portfolio for support services and is looking forward to migrating the knowledge to raise the standards in the hospital. Gary started his journey when he graduated from the United Kingdom with a degree in pharmaceutical sciences, drug delivery, and completed his dissertation paper on the effectiveness of potassium permanganate as a disinfectant against E. coli in third world countries. And so, Hank, as I read that bio for Gary, it's not really setting us up for his expertise in sterile processing. But boy, when we dive into this interview and people see the great work that he's done, having a fresh perspective with a completely different background has really served not only his team, but his entire hospital very well during a very large construction project, which we'll be hearing more about.
That's the ticket, Justin. And I hope that folks really take it to heart. Our industry grows stronger the more diverse backgrounds that we pull in from different industries, because all of these industries out there have their own best practices, have their own tips and tricks for how to improve whatever service or deliverable they're providing. So I love talking to folks who come from just random backgrounds you would never think has anything applicable to do with sterile processing, and then see how they leverage that insight and knowledge to improve what we're doing. And you're right, that new set of eyes, that new approach can really turn out with some creative things. And I think we're going to see that in today's interview.
All right, well, we'll be right back with Gary Bassi after a short break.
You're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Gary Bassi, Director of Medical Device Reprocessing at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto. And Gary, we're really excited to have you on this episode because I love hearing success stories and different ways to manage the day-to-day in sterile processing throughout the world. And so welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Justin. It's a pleasure to be on the show and look forward to speaking to you about some of the projects we've been working on.
So before we get started, I read a brief bio at the beginning of the episode to introduce you before you came on, but I'd actually like to hear a little bit more about your personal interests in sterile processing, maybe less of that CV or resume overview of your career, but what are you passionate about? And you can even tell us maybe how you found Hank.
One of my biggest passions is actually education, teaching, learning. I'm always a learner myself, and passing on and sharing the knowledge. So I stumbled across sterile processing I've got a good blend in terms of pharmaceutical experience, food experience, and then private medical device reprocessing experience, and eventually public sector medical device reprocessing. And over the years, I've applied those standards I've learned from pharmaceutical, cosmetic, food to the medical device reprocessing industry. And it all started when I started in the private industry of reprocessing medical devices for several different hospitals, and learning more, reading on the standards. And then LinkedIn at that time wasn't as popular as it is today, but as there was only a few people promoting that field at that time. And then over the years, as it grew, there was more content coming from LinkedIn, reading some of the articles from Hank that are published in Healthcare Purchasing News, and seeing those familiar faces on LinkedIn, and then joining the various groups. There wasn't that many sterile processing groups available at that time for people in this profession to join also. So that's kind of where I started and where I first discovered Hank, and started learning and joining these groups to better educate myself.
And actually, Gary, the backdrop to this interview came from LinkedIn as well, because I was surfing a couple of months ago. Actually, I guess maybe just a couple of weeks ago now, and I came across a couple of your posts. You were posting about the ongoing construction project, and in particular, you had a post talking about department signage. And as soon as I saw some of your graphics and I saw the conversation there, I was like, okay, this is a conversation that there's going to be a lot of folks interested in, either because they're about to go through construction themselves, or they're trying to work in a workflow that could be improved with better signage. So can you give us a little bit of background first, just about the big picture construction project that you're going through right now? Like, what prompted it? Why did it happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So Mount Sinai is a tertiary care hospital in the core of Toronto in Canada. And we're a specialist hospital. We probably were a little bit behind than the other hospitals in terms of renovation. And now we finally got our chance approximately 5 years ago, where we were awarded from the ministry some funding to redevelop our entire hospital, certain sections of it in different phases. The tricky part here was that unlike most hospitals where they're able to build a new hospital and move out of the old hospital into the new hospital, our challenging part was being able to renovate the hospital while we're still working inside it. And the tough part there was the constant decanting of spaces, moving departments between different floors so they can renovate it and move you back. So it's been a very tricky time, and you really need to be resilient during these times, because you're either going to be, you're not going to be able to handle the change and you're going to move on and say, I can't handle this, it's out of my norm, or you're going to be resilient and be well informed about the changes and adapt accordingly. So we were able to basically renovate our different sections of our hospital, two of the main areas being the perioperative suite. Currently, we have 12 operating rooms, and we're able to now expand to 19 operating rooms. We have an MDR that's located within the perioperative suite today, and another MDR that's located in the basement. And we're able to renovate this so we can move out of the perioperative space, give them that space back so they can build more operating rooms, and then centralize our department on the first floor and expand it. So we're going from a 5,500 square foot department to almost 13,000 square feet. And one of the key pieces of information here, Hank, is that for the last 2 decades, we've actually been washing and disinfecting all of our medical devices and packaging them in Mount Sinai Hospital. But because we're connected to the neighboring hospitals downtown through underground tunnels, for the last 2 decades, we've been sending our equipment to be sterilized at one of our sister hospitals.
Oh, interesting. There are so many interesting things that you just said. So I want to jump in here because first, I just want to make sure everybody understands what MDR stands for. Would you define that for us?
Yeah, so MDR is the nomenclature that was developed in Canada nationally and provincially as medical device reprocessing. We did used to use sterile processing department, SPD, CSSD, CSD, sterile supply department, but through our provincial book, all the hospitals standardized this nomenclature, medical device reprocessing, and then also known as MDRD, medical device reprocessing department.
All right. And then another thing that I've seen, I just wanted to comment on, was typically when I've seen hospitals do that kind of shuffling of the deck, they're vacating a department to make enough room so that there's an empty space to move somebody into as they rotate through and around. But what was really interesting about what you described is it sounds like you started actually sterilizing in the hospital, but you didn't even have the footprint for that. Plus, it sounds like you expanded the number of theaters or operating room suites that you have and increased the caseload that you could take on. But I have to say, the whole concept of the tunnels is really conjuring a very cool image. So before we talk about maybe everything that you were able to do, how did that work logistically in the tunnels? How far are we talking in terms of travel?
Yeah, so Justin, you know what? It's actually amazing. The tunnels are such a key element that adds to the circle of care that we provide, because we have our neighboring hospitals that specialize in different services. So Mount Sinai specializes in complex orthopedic. Plus, we do some very specialist procedures such as the twin-to-twin surgery, where we have patients that come from the United States and will wait in our hospitality suites to perform that twin-to-twin surgery. And we also specialize in cancer care. Our neighboring hospitals will specialize in cardiovascular surgery. And then we have another neighboring hospital connected to us through the tunnel, which is a kids hospital, specialized in children and pediatric care only. So if you imagine you're coming in to deliver a baby and you've come for this surgery, and then all of a sudden something happens during surgery, we're able to quickly connect with those doctors from our neighboring teaching hospitals and quickly take the patient straight into either the pediatric hospital next to us or the cardiovascular hospital, and leverage those skill sets and specialties that the surgeons and doctors have at those respective hospitals. So the tunnel is absolutely amazing. It allows us to transport patients between hospitals for different services. It provides a great overall circle of care. We're all still individual entities. We're not a network of hospitals. And then coming back to your point about the vacating spaces. So this is a very, very interesting topic, actually, because a lot of other hospitals, they decided to either rent a mobile unit, park it on their docks while they got their MDR renovated, and then work out of a mobile SPD. There's financial impacts to that. So at Mount Sinai, we decided to kind of leverage a different model where we could utilize the savings from the financial respect in terms of a mobile unit. So we decided to actually split our department into two halves. And we said, okay, we have decontamination, and then we have prep and pack and sterile storage, which is one zone. So we said, we're going to hand over the decontam space to the contractors first, and we're going to build a small room upstairs that's going to be for decontam only. So we would receive our items, we would take them to the second floor, wash them, and then transport them back to first floor on the prep and pack side only. And it worked out very well. And we did that for 3 years until our decontam space was fully renovated. But the decontam space, because it was expanded, became the respective 3 zones: decontam, prep and pack, and then sterile storage. And so now we're at the point where we're going to move into this new space, and the prep and pack zone that we're occupying today will be an expansion of all those 3 zones once we vacate it. So there are different ways of achieving the end goal. Space is a capital, it's a premium at hospitals. But if you do have the available space where you can split your MDR into 2 zones, opposed to having a mobile unit on your dock, you might be able to leverage those savings and put them back into your department through equipment or other ways.
I think there's going to be a lot of folks, Gary, after this interview calling you to find out more information about that topic in particular.
Probably.
Because you're right. There's a lot of logistics involved in that, and there's a lot of cost. No matter what you do, there's a lot of cost to renovation. But yeah, I think a lot of folks feel like the mobile unit is their only option. That's just such an interesting topic that I wish we had a whole nother episode just to talk about that. But to get us to the topic at hand, which is signage, and this is just one piece in that whole complex piece that you just described. Like, you're renovating a much larger department now, or you're looking to move into a much larger department. You've got all the moving pieces, from staffing, supplies, equipment, and everything else. Why the emphasis and the focus on signage? What prompted you in this build out to say, hey, if we're doing this, we need to pay attention to what and why we are developing signs for?
I would start off by saying that So I'm also an instructor. I teach the medical device reprocessing course. And so I get a lot of questions from students when I'm teaching. What is this machine? What is this? What is that? And, we'll show the design. How does this work? So I take that element. And then plus when I have clinical students at the hospital site, we have to orientate. I'm a very hands-on personnel of my department. I like to get involved. I don't just like to deal with administrative stuff. And that's because I'm very passionate about making the industry better. And one of my reasons was that in everything that we seem to do in medical device reprocessing, or maybe even other subjects for that matter, is normally it's a cut and paste of what our neighbors do. So we have the architects that come in and they'll cut and paste the design from the hospital that they just did and say, okay, well, we've won the contract. This is the design we're proposing. And it carries on as a cut and paste model. They cut and paste from every hospital and keep taking it to the next hospital. And the problem there is that you inherit the same problems the other hospitals inherit. So then you become this circle of hospitals that all have the same problem because we all just kind of copied one another. Same thing happens when we choose a tracking system. There's 2 or 3 monopolizers in the market and we'll all kind of jump on the bandwagon and grab that. Same thing happens whether it's sterilizers. There's 2 or 3 monopolizers and it's one or the other. What I'm trying to say is that we need to diversify. And when I joined the hospital and working through the many areas that I have in the other hospitals I have worked in, the common problem I always found was that wayfinding, whether it's patients trying to find their way around the hospital. And, we believe in service with heart at our hospital where, we take the time, we stop, we make sure that people know where they're going. But for me as an employee, not as a patient, it's me as an employee, I had a tough time finding some of the respective sterile storage areas in our hospital. We have 20 floors that we service all the way from 1 upwards. And one of the first things I did was try to find where all the different areas store their sterile equipment. And it was very difficult. So I looked back in my department and all the other renovation projects that I'd been involved with. And I found myself after each and every renovation project making my own signage. With my team, I would sit there in front of Microsoft Word, printing out signs saying, do not open this door. Keep this pass-through window closed. Keep door closed at all times. No food or drink. And I thought to myself, I realized that it started off when I first said, guys, I'm making a rule, no more handwritten signs in the department and using autoclave tape. Because this was very common to see signage in the department stuck on using the chemical indicator tape. So it started off from there where I said, okay, you know what? Any sign is going to be professionally done. It's going to be heat sealed. And then I decided to take it one step further. I thought, you know what? This isn't right because now we're losing that consistency in the wayfinding signage that we have that's representative of our colors of our hospital or the theme that we have per floor or zone. So I figured we take the look away from the department. Why not plan that when we're doing the wayfinding for the department? Why not take that extra time and plan out all the signage you're going to need? That's what really made me think and made me embark on this journey of we spend a lot of time writing specifications for sterilizers and washers and workflow of our department, but we don't take that deep dive into signage, which is very important, especially when you have new people in your department being orientated. It's easy for us because we speak the language every day. It's easy for us to say, and that's the washer disinfector, and that's the decontam return. But for them, that's all new abbreviations and language that's coming on their first day. And it takes a while for you to retain that information.
Now, Gary, you've given us a lot of examples of the kinds of signs that you've designed, and I think you've even clearly outlined the reasons for them. But can you spend a little bit of time talking about design? So you don't want them to be handmade for the reasons that you listed, which I totally agree with. And it doesn't make any sense to go through all that construction process and then have to be printing out signs yourself as a sterile processing manager. That part I'm convinced. But what I want to know, and I think some folks out there would benefit from, is in approaching the design of the signs themselves, what thought process went behind there in terms of what color they need to be, what size they need to be, where they need to be in the department. Can you walk us through kind of how you thought through that?
Yeah, definitely. So we basically took the design of the department and we split it up into the respective zones. And first we focused on decontamination. But before we even started focusing on where the signs were going to go, we wanted to make sure that the material of the signage was in accordance with IPAC infection prevention and control measures. So we definitely don't want to start off with cardboard signs, porous material and so forth, that can absorb moisture and be conducive to microbial growth. So we wanted to pick a material that was easily wipeable and non-porous in nature, that still meets the standards in terms of a disinfectable, wipeable surface that doesn't create a harborage point for bacteria. So once we had decided that we have a material, a finish that meets the standards, we involved our IPAC team, so they were okay with it. Our wayfinding team, we got the okay from them. And then we decided to take the design and split it up into zones and start focusing on right from the perimeter of the design itself first. So let's look at all the doors, the perimeter to the perimeter. Let's look at all the alcoves on the perimeter of the MDR. So the alcoves will store linen, and they'll store carts that go to our off-site centers that we also manage. So we want signage there to say, dispatch area, soiled linen carts, clean linen carts, or waiting area. So we thought of all the different signage that we need there, knowing that we share these areas with some of the neighboring departments, such as stores or materials management department.
So Gary, real quick, let me just ask about that. So part of the reason for the signage is labeling. I mean, I heard you say that we're using the signage to help train people who are new, but there's a labeling purpose here too, or designating certain areas.
Absolutely. 100% labeling, because this all came from my days working in the food industry, where one of the companies I worked for, their DNA was Six Sigma. And when you apply the Six Sigma concept to medical device reprocessing, everything has a place. Everything has a spot. Nothing should be in a space that's unlabeled. There should be no bottle in your department. There should be no zone or area in your department that does not have a label. So we wanted to take the assumption piece out of it. So we labeled the perimeters. We looked at the standards, and the standards are very helpful, whether it's the AAMI standards or Canadian standards, because they actually have a lot of language in the standards that tell you what labeling requirements are needed in MDR, from the packaging label to the door that you enter. So the first labeling that we actually implemented was our packaging labels. Our standards state that our packaging labels were designed based on the standards, and the standards state that every device that's labeled in medical device reprocessing department must have the following sentence. It must state, caution, product is not sterile if the package is open, damaged, or wet. Check before using. So we made sure that was printed on every single one of our tracking system labels, and we took it one step further by actually adding a generic email address to all of our packaging labels. So in case any of our customers, whether it's peri-op or any clinic internally in the hospital, or any customer outside of the hospital that we service, they have a platform to provide their feedback if there's any issues by contacting us on that email, and that's on every single one of our labels. So that's where it started from, and then we just dove right in terms of all the signage you need on the doors. No food or drink, PPE must be worn beyond this area, restricted access only. Service doors to the sterilizers. Every sterilizer has its own service door, but most of the time you find them unlabeled. We wanted to make sure that it was said restricted access only, maintenance personnel only. The sterilizers that you purchase from the manufacturers, they're great, they're beautiful, but most of them don't have a sign that says caution, hot surface. So we found ourselves in the past designing all them ourselves. So to your point, Hank, we divided it up into zones, and we took a deep dive into each and every zone, thinking about workflow, thinking from a leadership perspective. As a supervisor or a manager of a department, how do you give instructions to your team if your equipment or your machinery in the department is not labeled? How do you tell a group of staff, say that you're working on sink station 1, or can you see if you can unload washer number 2? But you turn around and you see, well, which one's washer number 2? Or which one's sink station 1? If you ever want to embark on a concept of dedicating sinks for particular services, that's the orthopedic sink, or that's the sink that we wash ophthalmology instruments on. You now have that ability to be able to label and depict that information through pictograms that can be printed on the signage.
So, Gary, I think You have given a tremendous amount of examples, right? And you even walked us through a handful of those workflows. I really love the point about the labels and about adding that email address on there, right? I've never heard of anybody else doing that, but the reason that you're doing that makes total sense, especially if you think about the number of ancillary departments that a lot of our departments are supplying sterile goods to. It's not just the operating room. It's clinics, it's doctors' offices, it's the emergency room, respiratory therapy. All of this stuff goes out. And many times, folks there, users at that point, may not know the phone number to call to get to MDR, right? But with that email address, you just streamline that process. That's definitely one of the takeaways that I'm going to take away from this interview. But before we let you go, I do want to give you an opportunity for folks who are in this process, or maybe they listen to this interview and say, okay, he's right. We've got to look through new eyes at our department and say, how can we fix the breakdowns, the communication issues, the confusion for new staff in navigating our department? What would be the 2 or 3 things that you would encourage leaders and frontline staff to do if they want to approach the signage issue the way that you have? Like, what would you tell them to start or focus on?
So, Hank, I would ask them to focus on get your scrubs on, get in the department, live a day in the life of a technician. I know the process from the bottom up. From my work experience, I've learned the process and slowly moved up the ladder. So I know the process very well, but also engaged in the change management process, engaging your staff, communicate with them what we're trying to do, engage them in the process so they can empower the change rather than oppose the change. Don't label something that you think is, technologically too advanced. Label it, make sure you balance it with what do the standards refer to it as: manual disinfection, chemical disinfection, high-level disinfection, and what do our staff refer to it as? Strike a balance there. Don't just call it something vague like disinfection. So think about the language that you're going to be putting on the signs, because you also get one shot at this. Once you've printed that sign, you're either going to spend a lot of money to get it reprinted, or you're pretty much stuck with it unless you're going to go back to paper signs. So think about it, brainstorm. 7 brains are always better than 1. Come up with a draft, share it with your team, and then engage them in the process and think, okay, what do you think about this? And so that would be really the key takeaways. And then also focus on standardizing within your signage. For example, if you're going to label your sterile storage area and you're going to say ophthalmology is OPH and thoracic is THO, then try to standardize that so you're taking, in the sense that you're going to take the first three letters of every service. There has to be standardization within the standardization concept itself. Try to have one theme. If everybody on the first floor is a purple color zone on the first floor, then stick with the theme of the hospital. We want to make sure that we're inclusive and we're not working in silo. Inclusivity is very important.
All right, Gary, this was a lot of great tips, I think, for the listeners. And you echoed some themes from last season around lean. And I can hear that Six Sigma background in how you engage your staff. And then this season, just very recently, we interviewed an administrator and he said the same thing. Get the scrubs on, get in there, do the work. So I got to tell you, Gary, I'm impressed with your creative thinking and your creative mind, and then the way that you've brought it forward, especially when you had a clean slate. So nice job today. I know at the beginning we almost got started down a different interview, so I guess we'll have to have you back to finish that one.
Yeah, no problem, Justin. Anytime. There's lots to talk about. The department that we've built is truly, I believe, going to be, one of the state-of-the-art departments in Canada and probably one of many in the world. So there's lots more cool, innovative things that we've done that we can proudly and humbly say we're the first to do. So definitely would like to speak further. And then once again, thank you to Hank and thank you, Justin, for having me. And thank you to all the listeners. If anybody needs any further information, feel free to reach out and I'll be happy to help.
Yeah, and Gary, you share that information on LinkedIn, so everybody can definitely find you there as well. That was Gary Bassey, Director of Medical Device Reprocessing at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto. And Hank, seriously, so creative. And I love the way that hey, this package cannot be damaged, cannot get wet. Just that reminder, because I know we did a lot of talking with Gary about how to put that signage up and really train people that are new to the department. But I love that he's sending this product out into the rest of the hospital, and he's reminding any end user or anybody who even just transports those sets, and really just make sure that they know some key pieces of information. Also included is a way to contact the department with feedback, so that it's almost like that sign on the back of the trucks. How's my driving doing? Call this number. And that's kind of the same concept. I've never heard of anybody doing either of those things, and it's genius. I'd be surprised if those things aren't implemented in like 100 hospitals after this episode goes out.
It comes down to the approach to the problem, I think, Justin, because if you listen to Gary closely, what he mentioned a number of times through this interview is he began asking questions differently and engaging his staff in a way to really solve the wayfinding breakdowns, the signage, the workflow challenges that we all have. But if we follow the cookie cutter approach that we only do what someone else has done, or we'll let the architects duplicate, what they've done in previous hospitals, then you're right. We're all going to end up with the same challenges, which is what we all have. And the only way to change that model is to ask the question differently. And I think it's very, very clear that Gary and his team are doing that. And yeah, you're right. There's so many examples just through this short interview of how you come away with a different solution if you ask a different question.
Yeah, great job, Gary. Definitely a success story, and so happy that he was willing to share it with all the Beyond Clean audience. And I'm assuming we're going to be hearing a lot more, and he's probably going to gain some LinkedIn followers as well. That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Beyond Clean by subscribing on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify, or by downloading our smartphone application for iPhone and Android. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review, because your feedback is important to the show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.